give IIT a shot and fellow American college. They said, fine, you can apply, but we're not paying for, coaching classes. There are many physicists who go into biology, and most of them have zero impact on the field because they still think like physicists. In science, coming second or third doesn't get you any recognition. But in science, it's a little different because once something is discovered, it's discovered. You can't discover it again. You have to be convinced that what you're asking is important, not just interesting or just a curiosity, but because you don't want to spend your life on something that turns out not to be that important.
Good morning, all the viewers. It's really my pleasure to bring to you today Dr. Ramakrishnan, who won his Nobel Prize in the year 2009 for chemistry. And our promise to our viewers that sooner rather than later, we will bring to them a Nobel Laureate. And so it's really a great pleasure. He has written two very interesting books, and both of which I have read. One is The Gene Machine, and the second one is the latest one, Why We Die. And the books are very, very interesting. The first book is a very lively and entertaining read about the race for unlocking the secrets of ribosome. And the second one is also a very nice read. It talks about how life happens and how it comes to an end. Both these books are very, very nice, and I'll talk about these books during this course of this. So welcome, Dr. Ramakrishnan, for this unique privilege that that we have got.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you. As you know, this is a session for KPIT STEM Dialogues. At KPIT, we are very deeply committed to enhancing the scientific temper and the spirit of innovation in students. And we cover students at multiple levels. We cover students in schools, we cover students in colleges, and we cover students who are doing their PhD here. KPIT STEM Dialogues is, of course, meant for all of them. And this time what we did, because we were going to have the privilege of talking to you, we circulated the news that we are going to talk to you amongst all our students. And we invited them to send in their questions. So in our dialogue today, I'll be interspersing it with some of the questions that have come from our students. And I must tell you that I was very, very delighted to listen to the questions that they have come up with. And my hope and optimism for our younger generation actually went up after I looked at some of those questions.
That's very good. I have to say that when I've given talks at institutions or even literary festivals in India, I am impressed by the level of questions in many places. I think often from young people. It is a good sign for the future of the country, provided they're allowed to flourish. This means giving them the opportunities, the resources, and environment. And that's up to the government and those who are in charge. They have a real responsibility because India has unique in that it has a large population of young people. In many countries, even China, the number of young people is much lower. So India has this demographic dividend, as they call it, but it's important not to squander that dividend. It only comes for one generation.
No, it's true. We have to nurture this talent. And sometimes, this talent flourishes despite the environment, but I'm sure it can flourish even more if we have a good nurturing environment. So let me come back to the first question that I had. You were born in Tamil Nadu and then you came to Vadodara, switching your language, so to say. You jumped 2 grades in the school. And tell me, during that time, what were your primary interests? Were you interested in science right from the beginning?
My parents were both scientists, so I had some idea of what a science life was like.
Yes.
But I don't think I was interested in science really until probably 7th or 8th grade, maybe. And before that, I was interested in, just playing games with my friends. I was interested a lot in reading. and writing. In fact, I would say, and now I've started to write, I've written 2 books, but I think I was interested in literature and writing. But of course, in India, parents don't encourage you to go become a writer or an English major. In fact, it's almost the other extreme. They all want you to be an engineer or doctor, and they don't even want you to be a basic scientist. And so I think, the culture didn't push me in that direction, because it is a hard life and it's a risky life, to be a writer. But society can't have just scientists, we need artists and writers and everything.
That is true. That is true. That's true. So, after your schooling, you went to BSc. I see this journey of yours out of biology and into biology. And if you could talk a bit about that journey.
Yeah. So, when I finished my high school, you see, my parents were very academic types, and they didn't believe in all these coaching classes for national exams. And I said, well, I want to, give IIT a shot and Vellore Medical College. They said, fine, you can apply, but we're not paying for, coaching classes. And the Baroda University had a very different curriculum from the standard curriculum. And so, although, it was actually very forward thinking, very advanced, it didn't match the kind of questions that are set for these IIT exams, at least this would have been 1965 or 66. Okay, very early days before this joint entrance exam, And anyway, so needless to say, I didn't do very well. And I also didn't do very well in this Vellore Medical College exam. And that also, there was a curriculum mismatch, but also only about 30% of the seats were for men. It was, Christian Medical College was designed to help educate women doctors, So I didn't make it into either of them. And of course, I have to admit, other kids were probably a lot smarter as well. And they simply did better. I mean, that's just a fact of life. But my mother encouraged me, she didn't make me, but she encouraged me to take the National Science Talent exam. This was a special scheme run in those days by the government of India to encourage students to go into basic science. So if you got that scholarship, you could not do engineering or medicine. You had to do basic science. And to my pleasant surprise, you had to do a project, you had to take a written exam, then you had to do an interview. And to my surprise, there I found that I was first in my state and I got the scholarship. So I sort of, thought, well, maybe this is a sign that I really should go into basic science. And my father wanted me to go to medical school, but my mother said, no, you should think about basic science. You might be good at it. And by then I'd become really interested in science. You asked me when was I interested in it, partly due to just growing up and partly due to a very good science teacher in high school who encouraged me. So anyway, I took this as a sign. And then Baroda in those days had a physics department where some of the people had come back from the US and had really modernized the curriculum. And at the time, I thought of biology as just boring and memorizing facts and not really that interesting. It was just for not very bright people, is the way I thought of it. And physics and mathematics were like the pinnacle of science. So anyway, I decided to major in physics, and I think I learned a lot in my undergraduate, partly because these teachers were very dedicated and tried hard to make the new curriculum work, which was really to not think of physics as just another set of facts you memorize and do problems, but really think about it deeply as a science. And so I think I did get a good education there.
After your BSc physics in Baroda, you went to the US. And
yes, that was also unusual because, most Indians won't leave after a bachelor's. They will do a master's degree in India.
Especially for science students, yes.
Yeah, they'll do a bachelor's. Yeah, engineering is of course a 5-year course, so that's a different thing. But if it's a science course, they'll do a master's or a 5-year course, take a GRE exam, and apply properly. My thing was done and that's what I was going to do. I thought I'd go to one of the IITs to do a master's. In fact, I think I got admitted to one of the IITs to do a master's in physics. But my father was doing a short sabbatical in the US. And I thought, and then this university called Ohio University sent a letter to my physics department chair saying if there are any students who are interested, they should apply. And of course, I'd never heard of the place. It was not a top tier university. But, it looked like the faculty had all gone to top tier universities. And my father was very typical. He said, "Oh, if you work hard, you can do well anywhere." And of course, I don't think that's true. Okay, I think he was completely wrong. But in the end, it turned. Now he died thinking he was correct. Because of the way my career worked out. But it's not actually true because, if you go to top tier university, all your fellow students are among the best. You're really driven to accomplish more. But anyway, I did get a good education at Ohio University. So any drawback was really my problem, I wouldn't say it was the university's problem.
And this was a PhD in physics, right?
This is a PhD in physics, but the problem was I chose a problem that I didn't like and I wasn't interested in it. And so I just was goofing off. I'd learned to play chess and I was going hiking and doing all sorts of things. And I joke in that book that if I had a PhD student like me, I would have fired them, So, and my professor at Ohio, whom I met only, he died a couple of years ago of cancer, but I met him about 10 years ago when, when he was already retired. And I was telling him, I'm not sure, whether Ohio University was really good for me. And he said, look, when you came, you were only 19. You didn't really know what you wanted to do. So you have to think that those 5 years allowed you to grow up and figure out what you wanted to do. Okay. And I think he was absolutely right. So it gave me the space to really ask myself, what am I really interested in?
No, that is very interesting. Actually, a lot of education is about exploration, right? I mean, exploration of your own self as much as
of yourself and what is it that you really want to do in life? That's an important question. And I think often, young people are so channeled, you take this exam, and then this course, and this exam. And before they know it, they're middle-aged and they're in a field that they don't like, they're in a profession. Many of them are earning a good salary, but they're miserable because they don't like that job.
You're stuck. Yeah, then you're stuck. Yeah. That is true. That's true. So post your PhD, you switched back to biology.
I wouldn't say back. I was never in biology before.
You see, from school, I agree with you. But the point was that in your BSc, you decided that you didn't want to be in biology, and then post your PhD, you decided that you wanted to be in biology.
So I wouldn't call it going back.
I would say you're right. And what is it that interested you in biology at that time? And an aligned question. What did you learn from physics which helped you in your journey in biology?
So I would say it was a push-pull phenomenon. The push was that I wasn't doing very well in physics. I was doing well. I did well in all my coursework and taking exams. But when it came to doing research, I picked a problem that I didn't find interesting. I had no idea how to proceed with it. I didn't even care.
Can you talk a bit about the problem?
The problem was about, it's about, something called phase transitions. It's condensed matter theory. So people have heard of magnetism, right? And so if you have, let's say, a permanent magnet, then it has essentially, it has an innate magnetism in it, like an iron magnet.
Yes.
But instead of a magnet, you can also have something called an electret, which has a permanent electric field. Now, in a magnet, if you heat up the magnet above a certain temperature, the magnetism will disappear.
Yes.
Okay. And it's the same and that's called a phase transition. So it's not that the object is melting. That's a different kind of phase transition from solid to liquid.
Yes.
But this is from being a ferromagnet to being non-magnetic, And so you can have the same thing with electricity. You can have a permanent dipole, electric dipole, and then electric field. And then if you heat it, or if you go above a certain temperature, that property disappears, and that's called a ferroelectric phase transition. It's not really ferro in the sense there's no iron involved, but it comes from ferromagnet to ferro, and the thing. So I was looking at trying to do some calculations which would predict, what was the reason, or try to understand what was the reason that this ferroelectricity would disappear, and how it would depend on temperature. But in fact, it was really a third-rate piece of work. Okay, I have to say it myself. No, it made absolutely no difference to the field. Hardly anybody read it. And and I wasn't particularly, by the time I finished, I wasn't interested in it. I'm actually surprised that they passed my thesis. But I suppose it was it met their sort of minimum requirement. But while I was doing that, I was also looking at biology, and I found that biology was looking at very big fundamental questions, and it didn't seem like you had to be some sort of genius to tackle them. There were lots of ways for ordinary people to tackle them. I felt that in physics, to make real progress on the very hard problems, you really had to be extremely smart. And I felt, I think, of course, that was somewhat naive, because to really do well in biology, you also have to be extremely smart, except in a different way. But anyway, it seemed like there was opportunities in biology. It was a field that was booming. And so I thought, well, what should I do after my PhD? I could have gotten some sort of job as a physicist, either in a company or teaching in a college or something. But I would have been doing really routine or second-rate work, And I thought maybe I should switch to biology, but I didn't know any biology. So I decided.
What were the interesting problems in biology that attracted you to biology?
Well, the interesting problems are very similar. For example, how do membrane proteins work? How does a brain work? What do biological molecules look like, and how do they function? How does the immune system work? So there were many problems that were around then that are still big questions, in biology. So, except that we know a lot more in the last 50 years. We know a lot more about them, but that just science is a sort of endless frontier. As Vannevar Bush, an American statesman, called it that. And so, once you solve a set of questions, it just opens up a new set of questions. So I think those were some of the issues, but I didn't know any biology. So I decided I would apply to graduate school all over again to get a second PhD. And some universities said, no, we can't take you because you already have a PhD. But others, were more flexible, and they said, sure. And I think 3 universities eventually accepted me into their graduate program. But by then, you see, I had married and I had 2 young children. And so I wanted to also be in an environment where it was possible to raise a family. And my wife didn't want to live in a very large city. So we ended up going to University of California in San Diego, which is a very famous institution for everything, including physics.
Yes.
But certainly for biological sciences, it's really top notch. And so, we had packed up all our stuff from Ohio, and I had to drive a big truck across the US to go to San Diego.
A beautiful place to go to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Tell me
lovely
in your
place. And, in those days we had a student subsidized housing for graduate students. So we had an apartment overlooking the ocean. Now, if that was private, I could never dreamt of living in a place like that,
And I mean, the weather in San Diego, I think there is like less than 5 degrees difference in temperatures across the year. So it's
Yeah.
very nice. It's a
It's
beautiful,
very nice.
beautiful town.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
Yeah.
town. Tell me what background in physics helped you in your future career?
People ask me that, this whole interdisciplinarity is
Yes.
very fashionable. It's become a big buzzword.
Uh-huh.
But I have to tell you, I think the thing that helped me perhaps is I was not afraid of calculations and thinking quantitatively. Okay. So when the time came, 30 years later to ask, is it possible to solve the whole structure of the whole ribosome? You had to ask what would be the signal from an experiment. And so you had to sort of calculate, do even a back of the envelope calculation on what sort of signal can you expect and would it work out? And so that sort of thing helped. But I would say, there are many physicists who go into biology, and most of them have zero impact on the field because they still think like physicists, and they don't understand what biology is about. And if you look at the really great biologists who started from physics, like Francis Crick or Max Delbruck is another example, they simply stopped being physicists and started thinking like biologists. Okay. And you have to have that humility, to move to a different field and try to understand the questions of the new field and then start thinking like that. I think the people who just stay physicists, they have very limited impact, frankly.
I see. Yeah. So I think almost since you went to San Diego, you have been working on different aspects and focused a lot on ribosomes. So for our lay students, can you briefly explain why are ribosomes so critical in the story of life?
Yeah, so everybody knows about genes. But if you ask an average person, what do you know about genes? They'll say, oh, it's something we inherit and we pass on, and you can have good genes or bad genes or something. But what genes are units of information. And very often those units of information are instructions on how to make a particular protein. So each gene might have information for how to make a particular protein. And the thousands of proteins in us are what make life possible. For example, the reason you're able to see me is because the image on your screen is detected by the retina in your eyes, but it's detected by a protein called rhodopsin, which senses light. Or the reason you can hear me is due to proteins in your ears, which can, sense things. Even touch, smell, all of those depend on proteins. Carrying oxygen in your blood, it's a protein. Muscles are proteins. They contract and so on and generate force. So you get the idea. Proteins do all of the thousands of functions, and every one of them is made by using genetically encoded instructions. Now, those instructions reside on DNA, but DNA is not directly read to make a protein. Rather, a particular gene, which is a section of DNA, is copied into an intermediary molecule called mRNA. Now, 4 years ago, nobody knew what mRNA was.
Yes.
Okay.
And COVID changed all that. Yeah.
And COVID changed all that because, suddenly people started shooting mRNA into their arms. Okay. Now, what is this mRNA that is in the vaccine? Well, it's a set of instructions It contains the gene for the COVID spike protein. And so it is a set of instructions on how to make the spike protein. And you put that in your cell, and the cell then reads those instructions to make the protein. So the question is, what is reading all these mRNAs, including the vaccine mRNA? But of course, we make thousands of mRNAs of our own all the time. So what is reading that? Well, what's reading that is the ribosome. And the ribosome is this enormous molecular complex. It's about, in humans, it's almost 500,000 atoms. So it's incredibly complicated. And so you can think of this as a large translating machine which reads our genes or the instructions in our genes and makes the protein that's specified. So each gene will specify
the whole range of proteins. It makes the complete range of proteins.
So each gene will code for a particular protein. So if the ribosome reads that mRNA, it'll make that protein. So if it reads the vaccine mRNA, it'll make the spike protein. Okay, but otherwise it'll make whatever protein the cell wants it to make, based on the mRNA available. So you can see how ribosomes, first of all, ribosomes are very old. They come from a time when there was no DNA, because before the ribosome, you didn't make any protein, so you wouldn't need a DNA to encode information for proteins. So it comes from a very ancient world before there was even DNA. And so it's at the crossroads between genes and the product specified by the genes. Okay? So you can think of this in some ways, some people call it the protein factory. Imagine you have a blueprint, that's DNA. And then you have a product, that's the protein. And then you have the factory that has to make the product based on the blueprint. And that's the ribosome. So those are some analogies.
Yeah.
They're not perfect because DNA is not actually a blueprint, but we don't have to go there now.
Since you took up biology after your PhD till today, it has been a long journey, in the field of, I don't know whether to call it biochemistry or chemistry, because your Nobel is in chemistry.
Yeah, but that's because the chemistry Nobel Prize is often awarded for discoveries in the life sciences, like biological sciences. As long as there's something at the molecular level, then it's considered sort of chemical. But I would call myself, I would say it's more like biochemistry and molecular biology. That would be
But the field, the boundaries of the field are also kind of hazy, because I don't remember the person, but there was a physicist who was very proud of physics, and he got a Nobel in chemistry, and he said, after all, chemistry is physics. So
yes. Well, Rutherford, said all science is either physics or stamp collecting. And he got the Nobel Prize in chemistry, which actually annoyed him.
I know. I read about it somewhere. I didn't know I didn't remember who it was, but So the boundaries are not necessarily very, very well defined.
But I think he felt slightly insulted. But physicists can be like that. They can be very arrogant.
They believe physics is at the core of this whole universe.
Yeah, but it's just one part of that mistaken idea. I know that because I used to, I studied physics, but it's a mistaken idea. You see, they think that physics is more fundamental than chemistry, which is more fundamental than biology, etc. They're right only in a very narrow sense. But the fact is, just because you can solve Schrodinger's equation for the hydrogen atom doesn't mean that you can suddenly apply that to understanding how the brain works or how the immune system works. Okay, so each field has its own way of doing, of understanding and discovery, and that's something that a lot of physicists don't seem to appreciate. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but there are some people who are very arrogant.
So as I said, this has been like over 3 decades of journey till that Nobel Prize. Now, such a long hectic, and I wouldn't necessarily call arduous, but certainly hard journey can only be triggered, in my opinion, by one of the three. It can be triggered by just curiosity. It can be triggered by the drive for recognition, or it can be driven by a basic competitive spirit. So how do you look at your journey, and what component do you
I
see in
think,
that?
the different aspects came in at different times.
Yes.
I think you omitted one thing, which is survival. So the point is, I had a family and I needed a job, right?
Yes.
So I wasn't sure, like if I dropped out of science, what would I do? Would I get a job and etc.
Yeah.
So I had to keep giving myself a chance to keep going as much as possible. And then, of course, I changed institutions several times in my career. And part of that was to give myself the best chance to succeed, to make it easy for, in terms of environment or facilities or stability of funding. So the number of criteria. So they were all based on a desire to give myself the best chance to succeed, or in a way, a survival instinct. And then, of course, there's always curiosity. That curiosity determines your choice of problems. But I have to say, your choice of problems also is determined by what you feel you can actually do. I mean, I may be very curious about how the brain works or about the origin of life, but I'm not really, particularly qualified or competent, to work on those areas. So I'm happy to just read about them in magazines and so on.
Yes.
But, you have to do something where you feel you can contribute something. So it's a mixture of things: pragmatism, curiosity, desire to survive. I think the desire for recognition only comes much later because, when you're just doing, when you're just a starting scientist or something, this Nobel Prize thing, I can tell you, when you're a teenager, you think, oh, I'll be a scientist and get a Nobel Prize. This is like a young person. They might do the same thing with sports. They say, oh, I'm going to be on my school cricket team and I'm going to be, the leading batsman for India. Okay.
Yes.
I mean, this is just a teenage dream. Okay.
Yeah.
But as soon as you grow up a little bit, you realize those fantasies are not realistic. Okay.
Yes.
For most people. And so then you settle down into things, and then you don't think about all this recognition and stuff like that. You're just doing your job. You're trying to do the best next step in your job and so on. But then, when you accomplish something significant,
Yes.
first of all, you sort of realize it. But more importantly, when you go and give talks and so on, other people tell you, okay,
Yes.
oh,
Yes.
this is, amazing. This could get the Nobel Prize someday, or something like that.
Yes.
Then you start thinking,
Yeah.
oh, maybe it can. And, if it is, then who's going to get it? There are only 3 people who can get it and so on. And it slightly warps your psychology. And I think it's not a healthy thing, and that's not good. And then you talk about, so that's the desire for recognition. You talked about competitiveness. There is competitiveness. So, in science, coming second or third doesn't get you any recognition, because
But
you can only
nowhere in the world, now most of the world is so binary. Either you're at the top or you're not there.
Yeah, well, it's not even that. In many fields, if you're, let's say you're a surgeon, okay?
Yes. Yes.
And you're operating on someone, it doesn't matter if somebody else is also operating on somebody else. It's not a competition in that way, okay? You're both doing a job, and it's great if you save somebody's life, by operating on them. But in science, it's a little different because once something is discovered, it's discovered. You can't discover it again,
Yes. Yes.
I mean, you can, but you don't get credit for it because it's already known.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of pressure in science to be first with important discoveries.
Very interesting.
And so that, I think, is what drives that competition. It happens a little bit in business, not quite to the same extent. For example, you may want to come out with some new gadget. And of course, you want to be the first in the marketplace. I'll give you the COVID vaccine example. there were several vaccines, including Novavax, which was also very
Yes.
good.
Yes.
But although it came third in the market, it has almost no market share, okay,
That's right.
because it was third,
Yes. It's a very
right?
binary place.
So that's the kind of competition that sometimes happens in science, but it's only for certain things, okay? And other things, you do an experiment, somebody else does an experiment, and both are equally valuable. And so it's not all the time that you have to worry about competition. It's only when there's something really important, some big discovery, and a number of groups are chasing that same discovery.
Now, over this long journey, I'm sure you must have come up with certain points of time when, the decisions were hard, hard calls, or times where you thought everything was kind of dark and there was nothing. And there were times, I'm sure, where everything was just clicked. So on the hard times,
There was
hard
a
decision,
lot of times when things were not working, and I thought, what am I doing?
Yeah.
I should have, I got admitted to Baroda Medical College, and I thought maybe, I'm a fool. I should have gone to medical school. I would have been a well-paid doctor somewhere, and and so
but hard decisions, I would like you to talk about them, because in your book, no, in your note, you talk about your decision to go from Utah back to Cambridge. And you talk to many
well, there
people,
were
and
several
your
hard
mother,
decisions.
your mother, suggested that you make that call. So can you talk a
Well,
bit
she didn't
about
suggest it, but she didn't oppose it. My dad,
that?
my dad is always like, he was the guy who wanted me to go to medical school.
Yeah.
He always wanted me to play it safe. Okay. And he told me, why are you chasing this ribosome nonsense? You have a good job in Utah. You should just stay there. That was his thing. And it's funny because he was a scientist himself,
Yes.
But anyway, but the thing was that I think there were a couple of hard decisions. One of them was when I decided to switch from physics to biology, and essentially it meant going backwards 5 years. But in fact, it meant going backwards even more, because I ended up having to take undergraduate courses in biology. Because I didn't know any biology. So it was quite a long step backwards. And then another was, abandoning a really very well-paid job in a place I really liked. I had colleagues I really liked in Utah. It was a first-rate university.
The city is so beautiful. Salt Lake City is so beautiful.
And it's a beautiful place to live. We had a lovely house. And abandoning that to go to Cambridge, simply because, I would have the stability of funding and, be able to focus on my work. Also great, LMB, where I work, the MRC lab is extremely famous. So it was also a fantastic environment. But I think if it hadn't been for the ribosome, I wouldn't have done it, And so that was also a challenge. And then I had to think, what if I go there and it doesn't work out? Then, I've given up, high salary, and I'll be in England away from my children and so on. And so that was also a hard decision. So there were a number of times like that which were hard.
What drove you in those hard times?
The fact is, they weren't really hard because they were all pragmatic, because the alternative was always more risky or worse. The alternative to not doing biology is continuing being a second-rate scientist, in physics, okay? Or the alternative to not going to Cambridge was that maybe I wouldn't be able to fully focus on the ribosome, and the field was getting competitive. And if I had just done it like part-time, that would not have worked out, and doing it full-time might have been risky. So it was about minimizing risk or giving yourself another chance or something like that. So I wouldn't say these were, people say, oh, they were very bold or courageous decisions. It didn't seem that way at the time. It was really more, I thought of them as pragmatic and rational decisions.
What were the high points? Where was it that you found?
Well, the high points really was when, you did the experiment
Yes.
and you really could see parts of the ribosome in the computer graphics, in the,
Yeah.
reconstruction of the image, and you knew the experiment had worked, and that really, I would say, was one of the big high points, perhaps more so than, the awards and recognition that came later.
So here's a question from a third-year engineering student from SOA University in Orissa, Ranjit Jumar Sahu Sayak, and 2-3 students. So this is very interesting. Since on the emerging technologies and molecular biology, with advancements in AI-driven protein modeling, how do you see the role of computational technologies shaping the future of molecular biology?
Oh, I think it's going to be huge. I think AI is going to, and I don't mean just AI in terms of machine learning and so on, although that's a big part of it. But computational methods generally have been playing an increasing role in biology. For example, even when you want to analyze genomes or look at how genomes are related to each other, you're using very, very sophisticated statistical analysis. Even to align two sequences involves some sophisticated statistical methods. So I would say the influence of computational science and mathematics is just increasing tremendously in biology, and it's going to pervade almost every area of biology, including image analysis and cancer biology, all sorts of things.
Yeah. No, very interesting. Actually, exciting times.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, and so actually, my advice to young students who want to go into life sciences is to try to get a core background in the four pillars, which are mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology. Try to learn as much of them for as long as possible before you start specializing, because you will need those other things. You will need mathematics and computer science. Really, if you understand mathematics, you can learn computer science. So I think those are things I would advise people.
Interesting. Here is one more. Also, I thought this student of engineering called Akshay Khan Bharti, what exactly defines life at the molecular level? And the second part, and how do individual cells coordinate to create a single conscious being?
Well, let me tell you, both are very, very hard questions. Okay, so I think life is, one of those things which about people joke that it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. Okay, many people would define life as a self-replicating, evolvable system. And if you wanted to be really more strict, you could say, based on, the ingredients of life, like carbohydrates, etc. But what if you went to some planet in some other galaxy? You might have a living form that would meet what we think of as life, but it's made up some completely different material.
Yes.
So I would say an evolvable self-replicating system, and so that's at the molecular level. But of course, molecules self-organize into cells, and so the unit of life in our form of life really is the cell. Okay, and the other question about how cells can assemble to form consciousness, I don't think anybody really understands. They think, consciousness may be what's often referred to as an emergent property or self-awareness. So when you have a collection of neurons that reach a state where, there's an element of self-awareness, that's consciousness. But this is now well beyond my expertise. Like, I told you, for example, I find neuroscience fascinating, but it doesn't mean that I should have anything to contribute to it. But I would say that's what
I think it's very
and
interesting.
both of them, by the way, are the origin of life, which is how you get life from starting from simple molecules, and the origin of consciousness. Those are two of the biggest questions in biology, I would say.
Yes. very interesting questions. At what point in time a molecule understands that it is different from the rest of the world and that it needs to self-preserve and self-replicate? I think these are very interesting questions.
Yeah, but one issue I would take with this, I don't think molecules understand anything.
They don't understand.
You could argue even what we have as what we think of as a free will is simply an illusion. It's simply a state of our brain that gives us the illusion of identity or free will or whatever. And so molecules certainly, they simply behave according to the laws of physics and chemistry. And so the self-replication simply is a property of the chemistry of that molecule. It's not that they decide to self-replicate or or aware. It just happens.
So in your field of work, what are the new exciting areas where you would like to see the young generation proceed?
Well, we talked about, I certainly think the brain and understanding the brain is a really important goal. Even simple things like how is memory stored? For example, if let's say I remember my wife's face. Okay, now to do that, there's got to be some sort of pattern where I can recognize the face from any angle. And then it has to be connected to the person that is my wife. I have to remember her name and the fact that she's related to me. All of those things are all interconnected. And so there's this whole series of interconnected memories that can be retrieved just by looking at somebody. Okay. And that's, that's just one aspect of the brain. And of course, then, how do you determine action? Maybe I smile, when I see this face, so that's an action that's based on a certain recognition. So I'm working with the brain is really, really fascinating. And the people are making a lot of progress because tools are improved. But of course, again, some things like AI might actually help in ways that we can't anticipate in understanding that. That's one aspect, but then there are many aspects. I mean, even how do we go from a cell to completely formed animal from a single cell? That's an old problem called development, and although we understand a lot more about it over the last 60, 70 years, that's still a big question. And what happens when development goes wrong? You might get abnormal development, or you might get cancer, things like that. So there are a lot of big questions. And I would say to your student, you can think of almost any important biological question, like why does this happen, or why is this the way it is? And you can go backwards and say, okay, now I can start working on it, and you can figure out how to start. What do we know now? And what are the things we need to understand?
So where do you see this field 20 or 30 years from now? Because that is where the students who go into it now will be seeing maybe towards the end of the
So I would say, one thing I would tell your students is not to be too influenced by today's fashions or tools, but really get a broad education and then really ask questions that interest you rather than what's currently fashionable. And of course, you have to be convinced that what you're asking is important, not just interesting or just a curiosity, but because you don't want to spend your life on something that turns out not to be that important. And then tools will change. Tools will become more powerful, and our ability to understand will be at a different level from what it is today.
We talked about the biological sciences. Outside of that, when you look around, what do you think are other interesting challenges in science.
Yeah, there are huge, huge challenges. For example, I can imagine, if you take physics and chemistry and material science,
Mhm.
how do you make sustainable energy?
Yes,
That's a big problem, and that involves a
yes,
lot of physics, material
yes,
science,
yes,
and engineering to solve those kinds of problems. You can have more sustainable materials, more ecological or biodegradable materials
yes, yes,
for everything we have. I have to tell you, when I was growing up in India, there was almost no trash because
yes,
there was
yes,
no packaging. Okay.
yes,
If you wanted rice, you would go to the store with your bag and they would weigh out the rice and you would
yes,
take the bag back home with
yes,
you.
yes,
And fruits and everything was all put in your bag. There was no
yes,
packaging.
yes,
Drinks were in bottles that you would
yes,
return to the person.
right,
So,
right,
so now you have all this trash, Indian
yes,
cities are completely filled with trash because there's no
absolutely,
no way
absolutely,
because there's no infrastructure to dispose of them properly.
yes,
But
yes,
also generating it is a huge waste. So material science can help with that. It can provide more,
yes,
ecological and degradable packaging,
yes,
which doesn't impact the environment. Then, of course, there are engineering and physics can produce much better tools, for
yes,
example, for medical diagnostics or for
mhm,
all sorts of other things.
yes,
So I think that, science really there it's at a always been exciting and it's at a very exciting time now. And I would say in almost every field there are really interesting
yes,
questions to answer. And I'm not even talking about pure science, like pure physics, of course, has,
yes,
all sorts of things like high energy physics and cosmology and so
yes.
on.
One last question.
Yeah.
So, both your books, Gene Machine as well as Why We Die, are very readable.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that
You have
at
to
one point
partly
in
thank
time.
my editors for that. Because the editors were not scientists. So if I started getting too, technical or not understandable,
Yes,
they would just exit out and say, rewrite. You have to rewrite this.
yeah.
And
But
so it
is there?
means you have to be humble, with editors.
Yes, yes,
You know.
yes. That is right. That's right. And but is there any other book on the anvil?
I haven't really, I have some ideas, but writing a book is a lot of work. It's
Yes.
typically about 3 years or maybe even longer
Yeah, yeah. That's
of
true.
effort. And so if you don't passionately care about the topic, it's not
Yes,
worth the effort.
yes,
And so
yes.
I have a couple of ideas, and we'll see how it goes, but I have to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. We would look forward to that, Doctor.
Okay.
We really look forward to that. And thank you so much. Really appreciate your
Thank you.
time. We spent about an hour
Yeah.
together. Really very, very enjoyable. I would love to welcome you to India whenever your travels bring it. I would love
Sure.
to welcome you to our city. I don't know whether you have visited Pune or not, but
I sometimes when I come to Pune, I usually visit ICER. And
ah,
so
yeah, yeah. So
where I
ISR is a
have
great
learned.
institution.
Yeah.
Actually, we worked with them on two of our technologies, which is energy storage without using lithium. So we
Yeah.
work with them on sodium ion batteries. We also work with them on fuel cells.
Oh,
And it's
right.
a very good school. It's a very good
Yeah.
school. We, of
Yeah.
course,
No,
also have NCL.
Pune has a special significance because, my uh, father graduated from
Ah, who is
Pune,
it? Oh, is
and
it?
he actually went to Wadia College. And
Oh,
but more importantly, he met my mother there. And
okay.
so
So, I mean, yeah,
so
yeah.
so
Pune
they
is the
so they
birthplace of
both
all good things. So,
so they both graduated, but they also met. So if it hadn't been for Pune, probably I wouldn't
yeah,
exist,
yeah.
so.
I feel even more proud of my city now. Thank you
Anyway,
so much. Thank
okay.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.